there are a lot of reasons that it took. I mean, it was, 10 plus years. Um, Part of it was because I think of and the sort of easy answer. It's funny as you go along and you talk about a book, you sort of begin to question all your answers for things. But I do think that it's true that part of the time was about the success of the first book. Hattie kind of blew up, and that meant that for a long time, I sort of lost my sense of discernment. It began to feel that instead of sort of my being able to evaluate my sentences or my ideas or my character development or whatever it was, it kind of felt like the New York Times was doing it for me. You know what I mean? Like my own voice about my own sense of my work or what I was doing or what it meant was kind of hijacked for a while. So, obviously what happened with Hattie was an incredible blessing, but it did sort of, it did seem to kind of drown out my own ability to kind of make decisions about my work for a while. And also I think, that combined with a certain set of expectations, like what will the second novel be like? What? It has to be better than the first one or as good as the first one or whatever. Which then kind of gets me into the sort of actual writing difficulties of it, because I think in addition to not being able to hear myself, I think I did kind of get caught in the second novel trap for a while. There was this moment in which I was like, I'm going to have the narration. Time is going to narrate this book. Time itself, these kind of ideas that I thought I was trying to get fancy, basically. And I was trying to sort of prove to myself and everybody else that I wasn't a one-hit wonder and that I had range and all this sorts of stuff. Those instincts were wrong. I sent a kind of mini draft of it to my editor and she was basically like, what the heck is this? Like, what are you doing? She was totally right. So there was a lot of sort of getting other voices and a need to prove myself out of the way. And that took a few years.
Yeah,
and then after that, this is just a harder book in a certain way. Its characters are more challenging in a certain kind of way. Its scope is very different, even though it takes place over much less time. It just was very, very technically challenging and very challenging on a character level. So after I got all the other sort of external stuff out of the way, there was the book itself to grapple with, which just was, I didn't know how to do it. So I had to learn how to do it.
So before we get any further, I want listeners who might not be fully up to speed on what happened with the 12 Tribes of Hattie to understand like the full context, because I think it's important. Mm-hmm. And it's also unique. Mm-hmm. I was thinking about you before we came on the air, and I was like, well, you're a writer whose debut novel got picked by Oprah to be a book club feature. Mm-hmm. That is tantamount in the literary world to receiving or to, finding one of Willy Wonka's golden tickets inside the chocolate bar, right?
Yeah.
So book one, you went to Willy Wonka's chocolate factory basically, mm-hmm. and that you had that ride, and that is a very rare situation. And I think it makes everything that happened afterwards make more sense, because you find, that's a whirlwind to get swept up into. And there's a lot more media attention that probably descended upon you than it otherwise would have because of Oprah's blessing, right? And
absolutely,
it's just what happens. And then this is your first rodeo and this is happening. Mm-hmm. And then eventually, after what, a year or two? Like, how long was the whirlwind for that book?
2.5 years, maybe, because there was everything that happened in the US and the touring, and then there was a paperback tour, a year after the hardback release. So the paperback tour happened, and then there were a bunch of foreign sales, and there was touring mostly in Europe for that stuff. So all told, with breaks, not continuous, but about 2.5 years.
2.5 years of your life, which is significantly longer than I think it otherwise would have been. Typically, especially for a debut novelist, foreign sales, they can happen. A European tour here and there might happen, but it's not likely. And you finish with that process, and you then set about the task of trying to follow it up.
Mm-hmm.
And like, how do you follow up that experience? And you sort of go into the experience knowing that there's no way
Yeah.
that this second book can match that ride, because Oprah typically doesn't pick, multiple books by a single person. She spreads the love around, right? So you almost know going into it that Oprah's not going to bless this one. So you're not going to have that Willy Wonka experience for this one, which sort of automatically means that it's not going to be as high profile.
Right.
But there's also a reading public and like a literary media public, if we can put it that way, that is awaiting this second book with a certain set of expectations, as you talked about. And that can be a kind of mind fuck of its own, right? Where it's like, okay, I'm going to get like, this is where the axes come out or whatever. People come after you if the book doesn't live up to the hype or whatever. Did you feel like that sense of fear?
Yeah. I mean, I think there's so many iterations, and it took so long. I mean, iterations of fear and iterations of hesitation and all these sorts of things. Those fears, I think, about sort of reaction, those came, thank God, later in the process. So there was this moment, there were these couple of years of touring, etc. Then there's the years of trying to just regain some kind of silence and discernment in my head. And then there were a lot of years of just kind of writing, in which, sure, obviously I would think about, what if everybody hates it? But the writing was so difficult and so all encompassing, and so many years passed, which at the time felt kind of awful and like I was taking too long. But now I'm sort of grateful for them, because I don't think the levels would have reset if I had come out with another book 4 years later or something. In any case, so it wasn't until I start to get to maybe kind of the last year and a half, getting really close to it being done, then I start to have to very actively be, kind of talk myself off of certain ledges, and, have these visions of horrible reviews and everyone with their knives out kind of going like, I told you she was a one-hit wonder. I told you she couldn't blah, 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 and that those fears became very acute, of course. But fortunately, I was kind of nearly done by the time they came in. So I was editing a lot at that point, which is, it wasn't great to have those voices, but at least they weren't happening while I was trying to generate. So, count your blessings, I guess. I don't know,
Yeah. I mean, listen, I think there can be positive benefits derived from a longer process.
Yeah.
Just because you get more time with a project, to really think it through and to really make sure that it's as like honed as you could possibly make it. And I've talked to many authors on this show who have had a big success, varying degrees of big success with the debut. And I remember in particular having a conversation with Leila Slimani, who I want to say won some big, huge award in France, like the Goncourt Prize or something like that in France with, it was either her debut or it was her second book. And she was very young. She was like 32 or something. And then it was like, how do we follow this up? Right? It's the same dynamic where you're like, okay, I did this. I got like the magic fairy dust on me. You know what I'm saying? Whatever it is that causes somebody to have like a great ride with a book that goes beyond just the book itself being excellent. Like there has to be some confluence of stuff. Yeah. And what she arrived at, and I think Tess Gunty and I also talked about this. She won the National Book Award for her.
And that was her
for her
book,
debut.
Right? Yeah.
Yeah. So it was like, oh God. And I could feel the weight of that. It's easy to understand, like, oh, now what? And Leila Slimani said something that I think is very wise. And I think it actually squares quite well with The Unsettled, which is that after she sort of quieted down and the hype sort of dwindled, and the whirlwind ended, what she said to herself was that, well, I've had some good fortune. I'm good at this. It's okay to admit that you're good at being a writer. There's part of the reason why there was the hype in the first place, right?
Yeah, yeah.
And the way to honor the good fortune is to take as big a swing as possible on the next book, to not shrink, but to like be grand in your ambitions. Like, because if you're going to fall on your face and if the knives are going to come out, let it be for good reason. Do you know what I'm
Good
saying?
Lord. It's absolutely true. I remember thinking, after I sort of doing this ridiculous, well, the narrator will be, all these sort of permutations of whatever, and then kind of got down to it. And I remember thinking this book is sort of stitched together in a way that I remember my editor said this in an early draft. She was like, the way that this is stitched together shouldn't work, but it does. And so it was the whole process of it was a lot of kind of fine tuning. It's actually ends up being also a kind of a plotty book in many ways. But one of the things that I thought, which of course requires a lot of fine tuning, in order to not sort of sacrifice its literariness for its plottiness, etc. But one of the things that I thought was, well, look, toward the end, sort of similarly to what she was saying, was like, well, look, if it fails, and if it fails loudly and publicly, God, let it be on my terms. Don't fail on someone else's terms, because then that's even worse. Like, if I fail because I was trying to live up to something, or I've made something that was not true to me because I was trying to, sort of chasing a second success or whatever it is, and it failed, how much worse would you feel if you hadn't even failed with integrity? You know what I mean? Or if you hadn't failed in such a way that at least you wrote a book that helps you grow, even if it doesn't succeed. So that the sort of failing on my own terms thing, I hear that very much. I mean, it's not exactly what she said, but in a certain way, I think it's very similar.
Yeah. Well, and like you say, this is a plotty book. It's also a very literary book. It's polyphonic. There's POV shifts. Like, you're doing a lot of things that require like a high skill level, right? They're difficult and they are somewhat perilous, right? These things can kind of unravel a piece of writing if you don't handle them properly, and you can lose a reader and all the stuff, that we sort of go through as we're drafting a book. And before we get any deeper into the conversation, I want to at least give listeners who have not yet had a chance to read a sort of broad strokes overview of the story that you're telling.
Sure.
And so I think what I'll do is I'll take a shot at it. I'll probably botch it, and then you can clean up my mess. How does that sound? Okay. But this is, at its essence, the story of a mother and her son, a woman named Ava and her son Toussaint. They are experiencing housing instability in Philadelphia in the 1980s. And there is a mother, Ava's mother, who plays a big role and is a very charming character. We're going to get into her, named Duchess, is in a fictional town called Bonaparte, Alabama, so in the South, while Ava and Toussaint are living in a shelter for a time in Philadelphia. Ava is trying to grapple with her life and to navigate relationships. She has some exes. It's complicated. There's a guy named Cass who is very charismatic, who plays a pretty central role later in the book. But beyond all that, I think this book strikes me as being deeply concerned with place and with self-determination. And it's kind of bipolar, if I can put it that way, in terms of how it is rendered, because you have so much of the book unfolding in the Northeast in Philadelphia, and then a lot of the book unfolding in Alabama. And so it's a striking dichotomy, North and South kind of dichotomy. And you feel as a reader that you want Ava, and maybe Toussaint in particular, to find the right home. That's how I felt. So how was that? What did I miss?
I think that was pretty good. I would only, and thank you so much for picking up about place. I mean, it really is these sort of two poles, Alabama on the one hand and Philadelphia on the other hand, and what happens I guess there's two places in Philadelphia, what happens in these places. And I think, I think that Bonaparte in a certain sense is kind of a sort of a spiritual homeland, or at least it's a place of sort of genesis for all of the characters in this book. And it's central in that everybody's like trying to get something from it, has left it, is trying to get back to it, wants something, that it has to offer them. So it's very central. And the other thing I would say also is that in a certain sense, Philadelphia, and Bonaparte, and in fact these characters, Ava and her son, and Duchess in Bonaparte, I think they're bipolar. I also think they're kind of mirror images. And I made a joke once to someone that I had essentially written the same book twice, meaning that many of the things that happened in Bonaparte and to Bonaparte are similar to the things that happened in Philadelphia to Arc. Things that happened to Duchess happened to Ava. So in a certain way, it's like these two places are, one is kind of a dark mirror of the other in a certain sense.
Yeah, that makes sense. And I feel like the rendering of, obviously Philadelphia is a real place on the map, but the rendering of Bonaparte was so vivid that I thought it was real. This is not the first time this has happened to me, where a fictional town has me going. I'm like on the internet, like, I'm looking for the Wikipedia.
Oh, that's excellent.
Like, yay. Yeah. And then I'm like, oh, she got me. I was like, damn it. It doesn't even exist.
Woo-hoo!
I'm sure but there are towns like this, because I think, just to make sure we put a finer point on it, Bonaparte as this place of genesis and as this sort of spiritual home to the characters in this book is, and like in its history, I guess in its modern history, an all Black town in what was previously, a southern state in the United States, pre-Civil War, and then after the Civil War, kind of like a segregated state where, Black people and white people didn't necessarily get along or mix all that much. But Bonaparte was a place where Black people owned land, had like a higher degree of autonomy than like was the norm previously. Absolutely. And so there is, in Duchess's telling of it, like a ton of pride and nostalgia and this sense of it kind of like being, at least in the imagination of Duchess, a utopian. There's a utopian vibe to Bonaparte at its apex, like in its heyday. And we're witnessing, I think, throughout the book, the kind of dissipation of that dream, right? Bonaparte is being encroached upon by white supremacists, and some of the shine is leaving it. And the place is shrinking too, because they're, taking away land and all the rest. But it's beautifully done. I also have to say that the sections where we are in Bonaparte are narrated by Duchess. For part of my read of this book, it's always mixing and matching for me because my schedule is chaotic. I was listening to the audiobook. And I have to give a particular shout out to the woman who narrated this book, and I even tracked her name down. Is it
Bonnie Turpin? No,
Bonnie
it's not
Turpin.
Bonnie Turpin. Yes, it is Bonnie Turpin. Good Lord.
Yes.
That up. Yes.
Bonnie Turpin.
Yes.
Wonderful performance.
Amazing, right? Audiobook. She's really, really good.
Doing dialects.
I was so scared to listen. I mean, I had some input in choosing who it would be, and so I chose her, and she's excellent. She's narrated many books, but it's always kind of, I've been hearing this thing in my head for however many years, and I didn't listen to the whole thing because they just said, read your own book cover to cover is kind of a nightmare. But I listened to just a little bit to sort of see how she sounded, and I thought she was amazing. Really,
she did a great
really
job.
Fine performance, right? Really good.
Well, like theatrically, like impressive and engrossing for me as a listener. But I think in tandem with that, I should say that you did a wonderful job in writing these parts of the book and really getting dialect done beautifully. Like there's so many great turns of phrase in the Bonaparte section that had me laughing. Just the way the characters interact, and I should have jotted more of them down. I think a lot of it was I'm listening, but it was like the interplay between Duchess and her friends and her partner, and just wonderful. And I want to know, I think I know that you're from Philly, but I want to know if you have like a lot of experience on the ground in Alabama or in the South. Like, how did you get to the place where you have such a like complete grasp of that that region and that dialect.
Oh, thank you. I mean, some of it is so. I'm from Philadelphia. I would make a joke that my family is 100 years of Philadelphia at this point, which is true. But my grandparents came from the South when they were very little, not Alabama, Virginia. My grandmother kind of famously within the family refused to have a Southern accent, but she just sort of she jettisoned it. She would not have it. There was a lot going on there. That's another conversation. I guess it's sort of a Hattie conversation, maybe. But my grandfather's Southern accent was really very strong. So I kind of grew up hearing a version of Southern accent. Not Virginia and Alabama sound very different, but and I spent some time in Alabama researching this book, but also kind of researching some other nonfiction ideas I had. You gestured towards the fact that Bonaparte there are extant places in the South that are sort of like it, or might have had a history that was similar to it. And one of those places is a place called Gee's Bend, which, if listeners are familiar with it, they'll know it from the quilts. So some very, very famous quilts come from Gee's Bend. And they've been in the Smithsonian, they've toured all over the world. So I spent a lot of time there. I watch a lot of movies, I watch a lot of documentaries, and I have been reading the African American canon, which, of course, includes Southern stuff coming out of the South and stuff coming out of the North, for many, many, many years. And so I think in some ways, some of this, it's an amalgam of things. An amalgam of sort of, of stuff I've read, places I've been, my own family, etc., that kind of sticks. I'm a good, don't have a whole lot of talent in this life, but I'm a very good mimic. I can hear things really well, and I tend to be able to recreate them very well. So often with this novel, especially with the Duchess sections, I read aloud all the time when I'm writing anyway, in general, but particularly dialogue and particularly the Duchess sections, I would read aloud to see if they felt right to me, like if they sounded right to my ear.
So when you say you're a good mimic, does that mean you can perform? Like when you're reading aloud, are you doing the voice?
I do to some extent. I mean, I'm always worried about being a ham, so I changed my tonal inflections, etc. When I read it, but I try not to go sort of full in, because then I'm a little worried that it'll kind of sound strange, or that it's just being extra, as the kids say. But I can. And I actually really like to. And when I do it by myself, or when I was writing and reading aloud myself, I would just kind of go full on in. And the other thing is, I think even in addition to being able to sort of mimic things out loud, I could hear her. She was a real gift, that character. She came in a story that sort of a little anecdote that appears in the second half of the book. She would have been born in the very early part of the 20th century in the South, before they started kind of damming up the Mississippi River. So there's this. So she tells a story about being caught in a flood when she was a girl, and Duchess does, and that came to me. I don't even know, 7 years ago, something like that. I didn't know, she didn't have a name yet. I didn't know where she belonged or what to do with it, but it just sort of came that way in that voice. And I was like, well, I don't know what this is, but whatever it is, I'm pretty sure it's a gift, and I'm pretty sure it's gold. So just hold on to it and see where it goes. So I could always kind of, yeah, she was just a gift, and she came in that voice, and I could hear her in my mind very, very clearly, really early on.
Well, that's evident in the writing for sure. And I want to talk about Duchess's, I guess you call it, her career as a blues singer, the work that she's done as a blues singer, her gift as a female blues singer. And I'm going to read a quote that I read when I was prepping to talk with you. And this is me quoting you to you, where you say, female blues singers were exercising a sort of personal and spiritual power. They were heroes in their communities. Their performances were cathartic. They were singing to people about their troubles, about their pains. People are dancing, people are crying. They provided a huge space for Black expression. One of the things that your book does so well, and it's something that I love in fiction is it integrates history
Mm.
and it teaches me things as I'm
Mm.
reading. You know what I'm saying? It's like it's all embedded in the narrative, and some of it I might have even missed, but
Mm.
I don't know enough, I realize, about like American musical history, and especially musical history as it pertains to Black culture and what the roles, especially in the American South, right, where
Mm.
blues music has its origins. And can you just talk a little bit about the role of that music in Black culture, and in particular, female blues singers, and
Sure.
what their role was in Black communities?
Yeah, I'm so excited. Nobody has asked me this. I'm really excited to be able to talk about this. Okay, so the blues nobody knows exactly when the blues started exactly. I mean, we can put it around as a kind of outgrowth of some of the things like minstrel shows and stuff that you would see through the antebellum period, and then obviously afterwards, especially. So these sort of traveling shows that would go around the South, people singing, people dancing. Minstrel shows were often, of course, as we know, white performers in blackface. But one of the things that people don't know is that there were also Black minstrels, so Black people performing in blackface, often because it was one of the few ways that you could actually perform at all. And so this music begins to sort of evolve, and we get things like ragtime, et cetera, which is coming out of the South, but also other places. And then you're getting this kind of amalgam, and it's coming out of this tradition of folks traveling around the South, which is one of the reasons that it's hard to kind of pinpoint the birth of the blues, because it's an itinerant music. It's an informal music. It's happening, it's happening in little tent shows. It's happening in what are called juke joints by the side of the road. It's happening in people's yards. It's happening in train yards. It's happening all these kinds of places. I think often people associate the blues with sort of some of the first best known male blues singers like Robert Johnson and things like that. One of the things people don't know is that the first stars of the blues were women. So we're talking about people like Ma Rainey, those kinds of folks. These were the first stars of the blues, and they were also some of the first people to record the music on what were called race records that then became sort of disseminated throughout the country. So I was really interested in that history of Black female blues singers who, as I said, were some of the biggest stars, and kind of were innovating and running the show a little bit until there's this sort of shift, and then the male singers kind of take over, and then the blues becomes, I think, very much in the contemporary popular imagination, associated with men. But these women, it's the other things that I was interested in about this is that this is a kind of spiritual music, right? It's secular. It's totally secular. And lots of church folk had a lot of issues with the blues because it was about sex, and it was about real life. It was about sex, and it was about losing your man, and it was about getting beat up, and it was about jumping the trains, and it was about not having any place to go. But it was also about heartbreak. It's also about, there are these amazing songs. There's one there's a line in it. The line is, I'm as good as any woman in your town. I mean, these sort of deep feminist statements about being a woman who perhaps doesn't fit into, or has chosen not to fit into, a standard narrative about what women should do or what women should be. Certainly not getting married wasn't a part of that, right? Certainly some of these women didn't have children, chose not to. A lot of these women are gay. Not all, but many. So all this stuff is coming out in the music. Hopping trains is not the usual feminine, way to sort of live your life. So all of this stuff is being talked about and sung about in this music. So it's very particular. Angela Davis has written, lots of people have, but Angela Davis, for example, has written extensively about the blues and Black feminism. So it's this there's a deep history, and there's a real richness there. So I was interested in exploring that, and I also was interested in exploring the sort of catharsis of the blues. As I said, blues singers in general, but these early blues singers, the female blues singers, a lot of times they would perform in juke joints, like little roadside places, music places. But then they also would have tent shows. And a tent show, a good way to think about it would be something like the secular equivalent to a revival, which is also a really big entertainment event in the South, in the early 20th century. And people would come from all over to these things, to these shows that people, when people were on tour. And they would sing, as I said, about, about being a woman, about, about not having any money, about being itinerant, all these kinds of things. But they would also sing about things like these floods that I mentioned. And in fact, I think now that probably that story in the novel, that anecdote in the novel, in which Duchess recalls this flood in which she was caught as a young girl, I think it comes out of probably some of Ma Rainey's songs, because I listened, of course, to a lot of that music as I was writing the book. I think it probably comes out of some iteration of Ma Rainey's song, or a Maddie Delaney song, somebody like this, who was singing about the experience of losing everything in a flood, which happened a lot before they started damming up these portions of the Mississippi. The point being that you're talking about these, I almost think of them as sort of secular church services. I mean, people are coming, they are weeping, they are rejoicing, they are exultant, they are exuberant. And this is a play, and this is very particular, and it has a lot of meaning, because this is a time in which there were not places for Black people to be that or do that, particularly talking about the South. We're in Jim Crow now. Now, in Jim Crow, of course, you were supposed to, and you needed to, in order to stay alive, do what you're told. Black people, I think, very often in the South had almost like a mask, right? You get these stereotypes of happy Black people, happy in their oppression. It's a mask, so you don't get killed, so that your family doesn't get killed. So there are very few places where Black people can express, can just be themselves, and can be themselves together. And the sort of twin poles of places where Black people could be themselves together, which is to express their rage, their sense of the injustices of things, their pain, their joy, their sexuality, all of it. The two places where you could do that were church and the blues. And so you sort of, these things are happening kind of simultaneously. And I was interested in both of those, but I was very particularly interested in the blues and sort of locating some of that history in a character.
Yeah,
that was a very long answer, so forgive me.
No, but that's a beautiful answer, and it's a wonderful rendering of this character who has a real power on the page and is just kind of like fun to spend time with.
She was for me too. In a book that was very, very difficult, it was so wonderful. When it was like, it's a Duchess section today.
Yes.
It's such a relief,
I mean, I was just like, get Toussaint to Duchess. That's all I wanted. Like, right. They need to hang. But I think there is you pointed at this a bit ago, but there's a really interesting irony and a really interesting tension between church and the blues. Mm-hmm. Like these blues revival shows as a kind of secular spiritual gathering, and the ways in which, like, what's ironic is the ways in which the church and the blues could be at odds with one another, with the church kind of finger wagging at the blues as not being, like a bastion of piety, right? Mm-hmm. But the exercise is essentially the same.
Yeah.
In different ways.
And the music is the same. I mean, it's fascinating, right? Like you don't get the blues without getting, like, it goes back and back, right? Like the blues comes out of a sort of direct line also of the music of the church, right? Like, so you get work songs, which are secular music, but then the work song music starts to get kind of, Black people, enslaved Black people are sort of being also colonized by Christianity, right? But they're sort of claiming it as their own, and the songs and the things that go along with the Christianity that is being sort of presented to them by slave owners and people like that, they're transforming into their own religious experience. Also, I think that's present in the book, but they're also transforming that music. So spirituals, gospel, all of these things are kind of coming out of that, and the blues is coming out of that. So it's, there's this sort of, it's fascinating how mashed up it all is, both in terms of the experience of going to a revival or having a charismatic or ecstatic religious experience, which is very similar to having, as you pointed out, a kind of charismatic or ecstatic experience with music. In this case, we're talking about the blues, but that also the music itself, one is an outgrowth of the other. So it's very interesting.
Well, and it's interesting to me the power that is conferred upon people who have a musical gift, especially when they are able to channel, like like a really deeply authentic way, the more difficult human range of emotions and experiences, right? Like a Duchess singing the blues in the American South in the mid 20th century, or Jim Crow South, or whatever it is, like that person standing on stage or going to a concert and seeing somebody who's just really gifted. And we've all been there, right? You're in some concert hall and somebody, like everyone in the room is just locked on that person.
Yeah.
And they have everyone in the palm of their hands. And it's just intoxicating. I can't even imagine what that must be like to have that gift.
I always make a joke that if I had been able to sing, I would have never bothered to write a word, which is really true. Like, why would I? Why?
I'll take it even a step further. I feel like every artist in any medium is essentially just compensating for the fact that they're not musically gifted.
It's really true.
I guess I'll paint.
I will agree with you on that one.
Yeah, it's a special kind of gift, and it's quickest to the vein. Music is to me. Like it just works on you so immediately and so like emotionally, and it's just interesting to me that the station that Duchess occupies within the community of Bonaparte is rooted in her musical gift and her past as a singer. And it just feels like an essential part of the book. And I want to talk about Philly. I want to take us back to Philly, and I want to talk about Ava's man troubles, and in particular, her relationship with Cass.
Yeah.
There are other men that I think I'll let readers find on their own in the book, but Cass deserves a conversation because he's a complicated man. And I got to say too, as rendered on the page, this guy is so good looking.
Oh, he's super sexy, right? He's like, really hot.
I'm like, God, I want to look like Cass. Like every time you describe him, I'm like, he's just a golden god. Like this guy, he walks into the room and I'm just like, whew, but he is
really, right?
Yeah. He's deeply intelligent. Well, I don't know, deeply intelligent, but like cunning, intelligent, a medical doctor who then loses his medical license.
Yeah. I say of him often, I was like, he's a doctor of dubious licensing.
That's right. But a bright guy, a very charismatic and good-looking guy, and Ava's, I think, central love interest in the book.
Absolutely.
And there is a part of the book, it unfolds in the back half, where she and Cass sort of reunite. And there is this thing which you touched on earlier. You said it earlier. It's called ARK in the book, ARK, which is an organization that Cass has founded in Philadelphia. It's kind of like an intentional community of African-American people in Philly who are like vegetarian, growing their own food. He's practicing medicine and offering medical treatment, maybe like off the books to people in the community. And he's kind of it's a little culty, if I'm being honest, like the way that the vibe can be a little culty.
For sure.
And here again, you are teaching me things, because I realized in prep that ARK is loosely based, at least, on something called MOVE, which was a radical collective of Black activists who lived in Philly in the 70s, 80s? I don't have the time.
They sort of came into existence in the late 60s. They still exist now, actually, but they're not very active. But the sort of heyday of activity through the 70s and 80s, more or less.
But an intentional community, a lot of the same dynamics, some of the same tragedies. I guess, I don't want to do too many spoilers, but can you just talk about Cass and his character? And also this, because MOVE, again, is in Philly. You're from Philly. So you're kind of drawing on that city's history.
Yeah.
to weave this part of the book like into
Mm-hmm.
the narrative. Can you just talk a little bit about Cass and his origins for you?
Sure. So we mentioned that the book is set in the mid '80s, and that was really important. And Cass, to me, is sort of a very big vehicle of time. And what I mean by that, or a way to talk about, or delve into, or illustrate that time. So Cass, as you mentioned, he's a medical doctor of dubious licensing when we meet him, but he was not dubiously licensed in the past. He was an actual doctor. He's a former Black Panther. So he's a guy who I think when we meet him in the '80s, he's a guy who's become really disillusioned in the wake of a lot of the freedom movements of the '70s. It's no accident at all, and I'll get into Move in a second. But it's which is when a huge incident, a horrible happened with Move in the mid '80s. But I'll get to that in a second. But um, I was what I was thinking was that we go through the '70s, and there's this kind of moment, I think, at large in the country, certainly among Black people because of the Black Power movements and Black freedom movements and the civil rights movement. But I think in general, also, you've got the women's rights movement, Stonewall happened, all these things happened in the '70s. And there's this moment, I think, when in America in which it feels like a little window maybe has opened. Not trying to paint that time as utopic at all. I mean, there was lots of violence, there was, all kinds of stuff going on. But I think that in the '70s, there was this sense of possibility, perhaps. And then you get to the end of the '70s and things begin to start shutting down. The Black Panthers are infiltrated and re-infiltrated, et cetera, et cetera. People are arrested, people are sent to prison. Things like COINTELPRO happen, so there are FBI probes and moles all over the place. This is happening with all kinds of radical movements, not just Black freedom movements, but all kinds of radical movements throughout the country. So it's as though that window of possibility that was kind of forced opened by all of this visionary and radical political action is then just getting closed slowly. And then it's 1980 and Ronald Reagan is elected, and it is just boom, it's snap shut, it's over. And there's a lot of folks that feel adrift, that feel existentially like a disappointment that is so deep that it is existential. They feel bitter, they feel lost. In some cases, folks are actually lost because people had jobs that were connected with some of these movements and things like this. So in some cases, people don't even, their livelihoods are gone. So it's a really weird period. And in Cass, I kind of want to, in addition to being like a little bit mythical, he's this sort of impossibly good looking and sort of tawny and lion colored, I mean, he was really fun to write
Golden
in that
eyes.
way.
I mean, just the whole thing.
I mean, he's just like, wow. A friend of mine read early drafts and she was like, well, before I get to what I actually want to say about the writing, I just want to say that Cass is really hot. Like that was her first. But anyway, so in addition to all that stuff, I kind of wanted him to be this guy in whom I could locate this sense of disillusionment and confusion and bitterness and anger, and a sense that the movements as they had played out had failed him and had failed Black people. And so this guy finds himself looking for, he wants a do-over, kind of. He's like, okay, well, that didn't work. So what could I do that won't be like the things we tried that he feels failed, but that has some other sort of way of perhaps succeeding. I mean, he's interested in Black liberation. He's interested in Black liberation. He's also kind of anti-capitalist. I mean, he's a pretty radical guy with generally radical politics. And I think that in reality, getting down to the character of him as well, for me, a lot of his political views are right. There's not much that he says politically with which I disagree. But the issue with him is that he is a little bit out of control. He's not quite in control of himself. His motives are murky, and that's putting it nicely. And his methods are controlling. He's a little violent. He's a little, so whatever it is that he's trying to do, I think he has himself at the center of in a certain way. He's a bit of a narcissist. So his political ideals get kind of thrown off course by his desire for power or for control. And also by the fact that he's sort of not entirely adequate to leading this movement in the way that he wants to lead it. Like the pressures of it, I think, begin to crush him a little bit. So he's an interesting guy because he's sort of a mix of things. This book, I think, in general, I wanted to. I'm always wary of people who are absolutely heroic or absolutely villainous. I didn't want him to be either of those things. I mean, he's definitely skewing more into the villain category for sure, but he's complicated, so you can't write him off. And at certain points, you sort of root for him, and then that sense of him might change. But in any case, so I was interested in writing this kind of politically astute guy who is carrying the burdens of a kind of general disillusionment of the 80s. Like I wanted someone in whom to locate the zeitgeist a little bit, particularly among people for people who had been disillusioned. The story of the 80s is often just kind of like, Bonfire of the Vanities and Wall Street and money and go and cocaine. And it's all so amazing and wonderful. And we're all at the discotheque making money hand over fist. But that's a very partial story. And I don't think it's just a partial story in the sense that it leaves out Black people. I think it's just a partial story in general. Also what happens in the 80s is, crack happens in the 80s. The AIDS epidemic happened. All kinds of things happen in the 80s that somehow haven't really quite gotten the same amount of attention or longevity in the public imagination. So I kind of wanted a character that could sort of hold the stuff that isn't usually the way that we talk about the 80s. I don't know if I should talk about Move now a little bit or if I should wait, or, I'm happy to do either.
Well, I want to say that I was pleased by the fact that this book was set in the 80s and that was the backdrop. I think it's like you just kind of said, it's kind of a misapprehended decade, the way people think about it or the way that it's often portrayed in the popular culture. And I tend to think that a lot of the problems that we have today are rooted in what happened in
Agreed,
the 80s.
110,000 million %. It absolutely sets the stage for the America we live in right now. In almost every way. In almost every way.
In a lot of ways, for sure. Yeah. I mean, I think like you can, I sometimes I'm like, well, maybe it was Nixon, you go back, but the 80s were really when things as they are presently constituted sort of got underway. And I read too, that in kind of assessing your work and your tendencies as a writer, that you write historical novels, like that's the way you see it. And you say it's really kind of impossible for me to write a novel where I have to contend with social media or cell phones. So I want to stop everything by 1990. Like you're laughing. So I'm like, is that tongue in cheek or is that it? You're never going to go past 1990 in your work.
I mean, I never say never. Maybe in 25 years, I can get to 1998 or something. I don't know. But yeah, no, I can't figure out what to do about a cell phone. I can't figure out what to do about Twitter. Maybe as these things become further away for me, and as they sort of get metabolized in a different way, maybe. But the jokes aside, I think we are writing out of, as writers, we're writing out of our obsessions in many ways, and somehow social media just doesn't figure into my obsessions. Like it's my obsessions predate these things. So yeah.
Yeah, I feel that. And I think while we're talking about your obsessions, we've mentioned history, and we talked about ways in which, communities, I don't know if we named it, you said Gee's Bend, Alabama as a sort of model for Bonaparte. I think there's also literary precedents that you're working from.
Sure.
like in the work of like Zora Neale Hurston or
Sure.
Toni Morrison.
Eatonville. Absolutely.
Yeah, those kinds of things. But and then also, as we were just kind of talking about with respect to Arc, this kind of intentional community founded by Cass, this character, it is based on Move in Philadelphia, which has its own history that you're working from. But in addition to being obsessed with history, I think you're also obsessed with spirituality.
Yeah.
And we talked about that with when we were talking about blues music. But you are, or at least you were, getting a master's in divinity. I don't know if you've already.
I still am, very slowly, because I'm also trying to be a writer while I do this. But yes, I'm at Union Theological Seminary. So yeah.
Okay. I want to talk to you about that because I think that's a very interesting degree. I feel like it's a degree that I would pursue if I had like a different life. If I had the time, it's like, okay, I don't know how I'm going to fit that in, but I think that's a useful thing to study and a very interesting thing to study. But I'm saying that with a very abstract understanding of what it actually entails. I'd love to just hear you talk about getting a master's in divinity and how it maybe has impacted your work.
Yeah. As I said before, I'm getting it very, very slowly, excruciatingly so. God bless Union Theological Seminary for letting me get my master's degree so extraordinarily slowly. But I am doing it. And it's been really illuminating. I grew up very religiously in a very religious household, very strict, in which denomination was not as important as sort of the characteristics of the denomination. So sometimes we were a little bit Pentecostal, sometimes we were a little bit Church of Christ, but as you can hear, we're talking about fundamentalist Christianity. And so I rejected that belief system when I was a teenager. I left the church, and I don't go to church anymore. But I still am a believer, and I think, and when I say I still am a believer, what I mean is that I do believe in God, but that's a whole separate sort of thing. My belief about God is that in a certain way, God's none of my business. I believe that it's out there, but I don't know what it's doing. And I'm not going to worry about it. But what I do, I think, the thing in which I am a believer is in belief itself. I think a lot about what belief does for people, how it shapes communities, how it shapes politics, how it shapes an individual's growth, how it shapes relationships between people. And in as much as my kind of foundational tradition is Christianity, I have kind of pursued my interest in belief through that kind of lens and through that realm. I wanted to kind of formalize it because I had a lot of intuitions about things, but there wasn't a lot of concrete stuff that I knew. I didn't know a lot about sort of theological inquiry. Like, what is it? Who are the theologians that matter most? Why do they matter? In what ways can we bring ideas in what ways can we bring reason and thought to faith? Not that I think that we can ever replace faith with reason, but somehow I wanted to give faith and belief a context. And I wanted to give it an intellectual context, and I wanted to give it a sort of knowledge-based context. And so that's why I went to divinity school. I wanted to go for a really long time. In terms of this book, I think, and I should say too that it has informed also nonfiction aspects of my work. I've been working on this an essay series for the New York Times called "Imprinted by Belief," and it's essentially a series of essays that think about the imprinting of sort of religious ideas in particularly contemporary American fiction, sort of wittingly and unwittingly, for better and for worse. These ideas are hanging around. How are they expressing themselves? What do they offer us? What ought we to get rid of, perhaps? So this going to divinity school and thinking about these ideas has informed the nonfiction as well, which I think of really as just sort of the other side of the coin to the fiction. Like I think I'm always asking the same sorts of questions, and the questions always are, what is belonging? Why does it mean something to us? Belonging in any number of ways: belonging to a community, belonging to a neighborhood, belonging to a racial group, belonging to a nation. All these sorts of sort of multi-layered questions about belonging. What costs us to be outside of things, and how do we bear up against what ultimately seems often to be a sense of struggling to belong and finding oneself in one way, shape, or form outside of sort of falling short of what it is that your heart most needs, in terms of being part of a group or a society or a family, or even loving the people that are your intimates in the way they need to be loved, and receiving love in the way you want to receive love. I mean, these are all questions about belonging, which then translate, I think, into questions about how we handle not getting those things, on again, on all the levels, on a societal level, on a racial level, on a historical level, on a personal level, on a familial level. So these questions just keep coming up again and again and again. And in many ways, and certainly this is informed by my foundational religious upbringing, I find myself drawn to this sort of Christian theological line of inquiry, not because I agree with the answers to the questions, like, oh, we suffer because of this, or evil exists because of that, or what have you. I often don't agree with the answers. But what I do find is that the mode in which the questions are posed are utterly truthful and utterly human. I mean, just so deeply human. And I think theology interests me because it really is this sort of attempt to trace or formalize human beings' relationship with the divine. So it is as much about human beings as it is about God, which I think is what's probably so deeply interesting to me about the whole thing.
Well, and I think I can relate in a lot of ways to the desire to learn about that stuff.
Mm.
And I think that, like, the loss of faith or the loss of community that you experienced as a teenager,
Mm.
I'm guessing that most people who go to divinity school, or maybe not most, but a lot, can tell a similar story.
Right.
And the reason they're at divinity school is to sort of try to put Humpty Dumpty back together again, and to
Yeah.
make it make sense,
Yeah.
because the reason you left as a teenager is that it wasn't making sense. It wasn't speaking to you in a way that,
Or it felt harmful.
that's right.
We certainly, a big part of the history of Christianity in particular, all religions, but Christianity in particular, is weaponizing it and using it as a big fat old hammer to get people to do what you need them to do on any level, inside of a family, as a society, or whatever. So I think there are a lot of people in divinity school who found themselves wounded by the faith in which they were raised, at the same time that they are thinking there is something here that means something to me. It's like, James Baldwin, of course, comes to mind, and I think of a book like Go Tell It on the Mountain. And in Go Tell It on the Mountain, the main character is 14 years old, and he has a conversion experience. And at the end of the book, it's very short. The end of the book, John Grimes is this character's name. We get this sense, because it's James Baldwin, who's James Baldwin's first novel, we get this sense that this kid, John Grimes, this book takes place in Harlem in the 1930s. We get the sense that this John Grimes kid is not going to remain a person who is in this church. We get the sense that his curiosity, his sexuality, all kinds of things about this kid are going to lead him away from this life. And the kid has the sense too, even though he never says it. But what he does say, which is amazing and is an astounding ending, he looks to a sort of brother of his in the church, and he says to him, I'm paraphrasing, he says, no matter what happens, you remember that you were there, and you remember that this happened, no matter what. Meaning, this conversion happened to me, and this moment happened to me, and my belonging to this community, and my sense of the spirituality of this community, and the immensity of the personal experience I have, it happened. It's probably not going to stick, but it matters that it happened. And I think that that's a really beautiful kind of analogy for my own interest in religion, and I think, as you were just pointing out, to many folks in divinity school as well. And there are also, I should say, at Union, because it's such a very progressive place, there are also just atheists there. You know what I mean? There are people who really don't, who have no kind of religious background and no belief in God at all. But then there are, of course, there are many of us who are in this sort of John Grimes situation. I'm not there anymore, but I was, and it mattered that I was.
Well, I have to ask if you're working on another book, and if these essays that you're writing for the New York Times might one day be collected, like as a nonfiction book in your future, where you will kind of write the other side of the coin, as you said.
I am very much hoping so. I'm being cagey, but yes, I'm very much hoping so. That would be, as the writing these essays for the Times has been, it really has been one of the great pleasures of my career. I think, they're very difficult for me to write, but they have proven incredibly edifying. One of the things that I realized about myself is that, I don't go to church. I don't really pray. I do in my own kind of weird way, but I think that my spiritual practice is writing and thinking, and so it's been astounding to write these Times essays, and I hope very much to expand them into something that would be a book length, because I always, every time I finish one, I think there's so much more to say, and obviously I have to limit myself by word count. They've been very generous in giving me a lot of space, but still there are limits. So yes, I hope so. Short answer, yes.
I've found in not that many attempts, but some attempts to write about these kinds of matters, that it's uniquely difficult. It's really hard. If you sit down and I get this idea of writing being like your spiritual practice and the place where you go to sort of find that solace, but also to make things make sense and to sort of figure out what you think, right? And how you feel.
Absolutely.
And to have to put it down on paper. Say again?
I said also rigor. I think one of the things that happens contemporarily is that somehow we've confused a little bit, and it is one of the things that I sort of treasure about the religious upbringing that I had. I think in some ways we can confuse a spiritual life with one that is purely comfort, right? So there's the comfort aspect, but then there's also rigor. It is difficult. Faith is not an easy thing. It's not easy to sort of believe in something that you can't see, that feels like it lets you down. I don't have faith, I think, in many ways, but being a person who was sort of raised around people of faith, it's very rigorous. And I think there's also in this practice of writing these kinds of essays, and also in writing fiction, there's the rigor of it. It's really hard. And the difficulties of it, in some ways, to me, sort of mimic the difficulties about being a person, right? Like being alive has its moments of absolute joy and absolute transcendence and absolute beauty. Then also a lot of times it's just kind of boring, right? And then also a lot of the times it's painful. It's painful to be a person. And I find that the experience of writing in general is a bit like that, Sometimes it's exuberant and joyful. Half the time you're just sitting there kind of being like, I got to get these people out of the living room and into the backyard, And then a lot of the times it's impossible and hard and painful. So there's also there's something about the rigor of it that I think attracts me. I don't know. Maybe I'm masochist. I don't know what it is, but there's something about the rigor. I
can relate on every level. I think that maybe writers have some degree of, you have to kind of be a bit of a masochist.
A little bit. It's like a narcissist and a masochist.
It's a wonderful combination. For those of you out there who are single, you might want to look for a writer.
Absolutely. It's fantastic.
Well, listen, it is a delight to talk with you again. Congratulations on this book, and I wish you all the best with whatever comes next, whether it's another novel or a work of fiction or an essay collection.
Oh, thank you so much. It was delightful, and thank you for this. It was really a wide conversation. I really appreciate it. Thank you.